Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. There is a dire need to emote with and identify with the struggles and hardships of Muslim women in Sri Lanka and their struggles for justice and equality, the challenges and the hardships they face. It is incumbent upon us as Sri Lankan citizens to educate ourselves of the need for advocacy, the need for action, specifically with regard to the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act number 13 of 1951. 3 days ago, the Ministry of Justice released the report compiled by the 10-member Advisory Committee on Muslim Law Reform. Tonight's discussion will focus on this. My guest tonight is one of the members of the Advisory Committee on Muslim Law Reforms, Ermiza Teagle, attorney at law. Good evening and welcome.
Good evening, Sonali. It's nice to be back.
Lovely to have you. Ermiza, today's topic is a crucial one that requires the consensus, concurrence and interest of the entire citizenry of Sri Lanka, not just that of Muslim women, scholars, researchers or Muslim men, but Sri Lankans in general and also the Sri Lankan state, which needs to act ASAP to bring in, to implement, to enact these law reforms. Speak to us about this process very briefly and we'll get into the technical details.
I think the process has been a long one as far as reforms are concerned. As you said in your introduction itself, we've seen the Act is of 1951. Since 1956, we've had committees coming in to give recommendations, been appointed by the state, been appointed by independent bodies. And it's been recommendation after recommendation without really getting to the point of having laws that make a change on the ground. It is really important that not just Muslim women and girls talk about this issue, but that everyone in Sri Lanka understands that laws have particular impacts on certain vulnerable groups. And if there is harm and suffering, then it's all of our responsibility to engage, to understand what's happening, and to decide where we fall in terms of our support. So I think on the question of equality and on the question of non-discrimination, that is something that everyone in Sri Lanka can use as the in the conversation on Muslim marriage and divorce law reform.
Fantastic. Just to take you through how mind-boggling this reform process of the MMDA has been. Very briefly, a timeline of the national reform efforts. In 1956, the Marriage and Divorce Commission is appointed. Then there's the Farooq Committee of 1973, Muslim Personal Law Reforms Committee of 1984, Shahabdin Committee of 1990, Independent Committee on Muslim Personal Law Reforms in 2006, and the Massouf Committee of 2009. So the final committee that was chaired by retired Justice Salim Massouf, following 9 years of deliberation, the committee submitted a report to the Justice Ministry in 2018, but no consensus was reached on the final contents. Subsequently, it was in 2020, then Minister of Justice Ali Sabri appointed this present 10-member advisory committee on Muslim law reforms. Ermiza, what has that process been? As in, since you were also a member of this committee, advisory committee, speak to us about the process that was entailed in the compilation of this report and the interactions with the state.
Right. The committee was appointed in December 2020. And they submitted a report, including myself as a committee member. We submitted our report in June 2021.
Okay.
There were series of deliberations. Right. And as a committee, we decided that the way we wanted to conduct the discussions was under Chatham House rules. So I think the fact that now 3 days ago that the report has been published, which is an important step, that people get to engage with the reforms and recommendations that have been proposed. The report itself reflects the kind of discussion that took place within the committee. And it's really interesting, and I feel it's a important thing to see discussion in this respectful, diverse opinions and interests coming together, which is a reflection of the Muslim communities in Sri Lanka. So there is this diversity within the committee as well. The committee members bring different expertise in, and you see that engagement in the report. And what we see at the end of the report is a series of recommendations and also a draft law, proposed draft law. And a large number of those recommendations are unanimously agreed on by all committee members. There are about 2 or 3 issues that there were divisions. The divisions have been recorded as individuals proposing particular positions, and then which position is moved forward on is left to the Minister of Justice, because that is who the committee is advising at the end of the day.
Right. Okay. So since we have about 35 minutes, let's get into the problematic areas of the law. And towards the end of the interview, we can also talk about the recommendations, the way forward. Under the MMDA, the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act, there is no minimum age of marriage. So even a girl under 12 years could be married without prior authorization. Speak to us about how problematic this is, given the fact that under the General Marriage Registrations Ordinance, the minimum age of marriage is 18 years. Speak to us also about the Penal Code provision, which says under the age of 16, even consensual sexual intercourse is called statutory rape. So the discrepancies between all of this, speak to us about that.
Child marriage has been a big issue in the MMDA reforms conversation. The group that I work with, Muslim Personal Law Reform Action Group, has a position paper up on their website which has some of the case studies, and I think it's really important to understand those practical lived realities of children and their families and what it means to their futures as well. So these case studies tell us stories of children who are married at a very young age, and about when we last looked at the statistics, so now it was maybe in the period 2012, 2014, 2016, and a majority of the marriages, in the almost 80-90% in Colombo, Kandy, and in the East, were young Muslim women between the ages of 16 and 17. That was the prime age of underage marriages. They've just finished their O-levels. They're not able to do their A-levels as a result of being married. They're unable to pursue higher education or any kind of vocation, professional training. There are several cases of domestic violence and not being able to handle the relationship with your spouse and not be able to seek redress and not get sufficient support from your family members when you do undergo domestic violence. Also burdened with having to deal with spouses that are also having second and third marriages, having to deal with child care and household responsibilities. It is a huge burden, and when these marriages end in divorce, it is extremely difficult to build a life again, because you're marginalized in many ways, including not being able to get back to school. If they had stopped before levels and were going to school, schools also don't sometimes accept children who have been married or are married. So a whole spectrum of issues affecting their own personal development, and the saddest of stories, who do they talk to? And when divorce cases come forward, we've heard that a husband has divorced a wife, one of the complaints being also she's watching TV all the time. She's a young child. That is what she probably wants to do. And this sensitivity, this understanding of these lived realities and responding to them is where we have failed when we don't bring about reform.
Okay. Wow. Okay, another problematic area in the MMDA. MMDA does not require a woman's consent for marriage, just the man's consent and the woman's guardian's consent. What's that all about? So
in the MMDA as it is now, and the way the marriage registration form is designed, there is no place for the signature of the bride. It is believed that the bride's wali or guardian is capable and has the consent of the bride to give the bride in marriage. But as a result of this exclusion of the Muslim woman from the marriage ceremony and presence sometimes, there are many stories where they were not present at the time of the wedding. They were doing something else. They were at home, engaged in household chores while the wedding was happening in the mosque or in some other place. So this absence of the Muslim woman at the marriage ceremony,
at her own marriage
ceremony, an exclusion from signing and agreeing and consenting to this marriage between herself and her future spouse, has led to things like forced marriages, has led to things that where they are not in agreement with who they are going to get married to. They don't know that person. There is not enough information given because guardians believe they know best. There is then it also has created room for there not to be a conversation between the young woman, or sometimes not so young woman, even older women. Sometimes the families believe the guardian can simply give the woman away in marriage with very little discussion or her having very little agency in that decision. So I think this is not just the law excluding, but the law creates this space for abuse of that provision also in ways where you force, where you beat, where you subject a woman to domestic violence simply to get this marriage done.
Also, this legal requirement for a wife's consent in the instances of polygamy. So MMDA permits a Muslim man to marry up to 4 women. Miza, let's speak about the problems with this situation, because in several polygamous marriages in Sri Lanka, we find that there's a failure to maintain the wife and children from previous marriages, abandonment of existing wife at the time the next marriage is contracted, loss of love, affection and kindness to the children of the previous marriages.
Yes.
Like these are very grave social issues that we're creating by law.
Polygamy is, as you just said, it's made permissible under the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act. And I think there are several now research studies that show, not just in Sri Lanka, but in other countries that have similar provision. So you look at Malaysia, you look at Singapore, you look at other countries that also permit polygamy for the Muslim communities, that the social relationships or the family relationships that follow from polygamous marriages is extremely fraught with this lack of care and concern for the first wife, the ease with which or the times with which, let's say there are instances where men use the threat of polygamy to discipline, to ask for particular things done around the house from the first wife, and they say, you know, if you don't do these things, I will marry someone else. So that threat is not a relationship based on love and care and affection, which relationships, marriage relationships in particular, are supposed to be about. We don't foster that environment. The understanding as to why there is polygamy is permissible in Islam goes back to pre-Islamic times, before Islam came in, because there was polygamous ways of life, right? That's the way in which individuals functioned. And when Islam came in, the passage in the Quran reads that you should restrict yourself to 4 wives. So it is with a advice or with a approach to restriction that it has been brought in. There are many studies now where jurists, Islamic jurists in particular, talk about the reason for restriction being the responsibility that you need to have towards your spouse. And it is one of love, affection, care, respect, And if the practice of polygamy that we see in Sri Lanka, and it's so hard to document this because there is no records, the marriage certificates don't have a place to say this is the third or second or fourth marriage. So we are unable to then track, except for the many stories that you hear from individuals who come before the Qazi courts asking for divorces, and spouses saying, you know, I have a second wife, I have another family, and I have to support them as well. It's in those instances that you see the polygamous marriages that happen. So I think it's really important to understand that that understanding of love, respect, care, compassion is not there in the way that it is practiced today. And that needs to be taken into account when legislating reform, whereas nothing has been taken into account to date.
Also, another concern, the MMDA says that only Muslim males can be appointed to the positions of Qazis and marriage registrars. Now, these are government salaried, tax funded positions. Why aren't women allowed?
In this day and age, I'm flummoxed to be sitting here with you trying to explain why women should be in positions of official positions of office, right? This Sri Lankan state and a constitution that guarantees equality for all has not been able to do this for too long. And at this point, it's not a matter of urgency. It ought to have been done many years ago. These are official positions. Marriage registrar requires a fairly straightforward set of qualifications or characteristics that bring you into that position. Qazi is the person who adjudicates. We have so many Muslim women holding so many responsible positions in Sri Lanka right now, whether it's in the various professions, the legal, the medical, within the Attorney General's department. We've had so many Muslim women showing so much capacity. This is not a question of women and women. It would be too much to even say that in this day and age that women don't have the capacity to hold positions, to make simple decisions at the level of the Qazi about matrimonial family affairs. So we cannot abide by this at all. The state has a very, very straightforward responsibility and is answerable to its citizens as well as to international, for the way in the Islamic law is that there are specific ways of divorce. So talaq divorce is for the man, and he can come to court and say that he wants to divorce his wife. He doesn't have to give reasons. He simply needs to state that fact, and the divorce is granted. If he says it 3 times, but before Qazi, it's granted. The logic behind that, if one were to look at, is because it was prevented, the man was prevented from raising complaints against the wife, which is why he didn't have to give reasons. He didn't have to come to court and say she's bad, she's this, she's not doing things, or she's doing things that are hurtful. He doesn't, that opportunity for him to complain and say bad things about the wife was removed as part of this process. The woman coming to court is also called the fasa. There are fasa, there is kula. There is also mubarak divorce, which is mutual consent, divorce by mutual consent, which is a very important form of divorce where both parties agree, amicably decide to part ways. And it's a nice thing that the Muslim law actually recognizes it. It's something that we are discussing as part of the general law reforms on family law in Sri Lanka. Because it's a progressive move, it is very respectful of both individuals. But the FASA process for women in Sri Lanka is that they need to go to court, they need to bring witnesses, they need to make out a case as to what the husband has done, the wrongdoing, for the wife to obtain a divorce. And then what happens in this legal process is the burden of proof on the wife is higher. Whereas the man comes and says, on the wife, she has all of this to achieve in terms of bringing witnesses and all. And some of the things that happen to her, if it's domestic violence, for example, it's very difficult to find witnesses who have witnessed the domestic violence that happened within the 4 corners of your home. And then qazis have also made it very difficult for women by insisting on male witnesses, for example, only agreeing to male witnesses and not allowing people that she would have actually confided in or would have been, like her mother, for example, may have been in the same house and is able to testify to that fact. So there has been a lot of procedural hardships that have also been created. Another reason for another procedural hardship is that while the talaq divorce is complete and there's very little room for appeal, the fasa divorce can be appealed, the decision. Once she obtains a divorce, fasa divorce, that decision can be appealed by the man. And it takes many years then to see an end. And women are struggling because they are looking after children, they are going to court, they're trying to figure this out. It can go from the Board of Qazi to the Court of Appeal to the Supreme Court. It's a very long appeal process. In the meantime, because the man can also marry up to 4 wives, it's often the case that we've seen that he moves on. And this unfairness creates bitterness, creates frustration for that woman. It's very difficult to then, for her to move beyond this and think of life anew with another person and her child, focus on the child, things like that. So I think the difficulties that have been created as a result of the differences in procedure need to also be addressed.
All right. We are in conversation with Attorney at Law Ermiza Teagle on the problems, the issues surrounding the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act. We're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back.
We are prepared in whatever manner to face the elections and the best where the best party win.
And an election is really a legitimate way in which people can express their opinion.
Country is in a very bad situation and people are looking for change. They want solutions to the problem.
Why must the people have faith in a government that couldn't deliver to deliver now at this very important juncture in this country?
Face the Nation every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. on TV1.
Everybody is the same, you have done this, and we have been very unfortunate for us to do politics under Mr. Wickremesinghe.
It's not just about clearing out people, it's also about relooking and reallocating these resources.
All my life in politics can be justified in any forum. It is open to anyone to ask as to why, what was done by me in my political career.
Mr. Wickremesinghe is fond, if that's the right word, of saying that he has international connections. And now he's saying that the IMF, everything is down to the IMF. The high taxes are because of the IMF.
Newsline, Monday to Friday at 8:30 p.m. on TV1.
Welcome back here with the People's Platform. Ermiza, we were discussing the problems related to the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act and how reform is urgently needed. Let's speak about the urgency of bringing in reform. Now we're talking about reforming an act that was enacted, drafted by an all-male committee in 1951. 6 committees later, no reform as yet. So, are you saying that today, if a 12-year-old Muslim girl can get married under the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act?
Yes, she can. She can be married under the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act. I think in Sri Lanka today, the provisions of the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act are probably one of the least progressive, the least or the most regressive of Islamic laws that we see even across the world. Because in other countries where there is Muslim law, Islamic law, particularly on marriage and divorce, there have been developments. The law changes depending on the issues people are facing, for various reasons, but there is movement, there is development of the law which is sometimes is responsive, not always good, but it moves. And as you just said, since 1951, we have not been able to substantively make changes, make the law relevant to the Muslim communities in Sri Lanka. And I think particularly now, I would feel the urgency, because as I go around and talk to people, with COVID and the difficulties that came in during that time, pressures on the families, now with the economic crisis, and we see this may be prompting, it's something to be studied. The fact that there are no facts and figures and numbers that the state also collects on these things is really regrettable. But ad hoc information about increasing numbers perhaps of child marriages. The stories are certainly coming in, and we are responding, and other organizations, women's organizations working on the ground who have been doing long years of work in this area and have been also facing the backlash when they do talk about reforms, which is something that we really also need to air out at some point, because they do the difficult work of this family law, ensuring that the family law functions and taking women to the courts and advising and counseling and all of that. And when they do try to bring up these grievances, there's such a backlash in terms of harassment, threats, intimidation, which then they're unable to, in those spaces, really move out of. It's really causing a lot of pain and suffering in those communities, in those organizations, for women working on this issue for a long time.
Misa, I think the elephant in the room is, who are these bad guys? Who are the forces behind stopping or halting reform from taking place that will benefit women and girls in Sri Lanka who are Muslims?
It's an interesting question. And I think naming bad guys is, I mean, the response has to be complicated, right? Because there are several groups and elements that have, from time to time, not been in favor of MMDA reform. MMDA reform has come to represent not just family law reform for Muslims, but come to represent Muslim identity in Sri Lanka, in a country that has also caused much pain and suffering for Muslims as a minority. So now we have groups holding on to this family law and any changes to it, because they feel that it's a loss of identity in it if it is to be changed in any way. So there are complexities in the political fabric, in the way governance has happened in Sri Lanka, in the way consecutive governments have also treated minorities, including Muslims. The last few years have been particularly hard. I mean, looking at during COVID time and the burial issue, looking at under the PTA, there have been very many issues where there has been state organizations have really been very harsh in the way that Muslims and their interaction with the state have been very difficult interactions. And that marginalization as a minority community, I think the Tamil community has also experienced this in the past, and the Muslim community is experiencing it. That ability to interact with minorities is something that we need to look at as a broader issue.
Of course.
But it is in that context, in that fabric, that MMDA reform is trying to happen. And there are conservative elements who don't want change for patriarchal, misogynistic reasons as well, because they are having either they are engaging in polygamy or they are holding positions of power that they don't want to see to let go of. Even the Qazi court system at this point, what we are talking about in terms of reform is to bring to bring qualified persons into adjudicating on these issues. At the moment, it's just a network of any male Muslim person of suitable attainments. This is not good enough in this day and age, and it is susceptible to corruption, which we see. it is susceptible to abuse of power, which we see. And this exercise of power over women that come to Qazi courts is an experience that they speak about. So it is a power battle at the community level, at the interaction at the Qazi level, at a political level, national level. And I think that is the significance of MMDA reform.
This discourse is, as you said, so nuanced, so layered, but ultimately the conversation has to be inclusive. There needs to be education and awareness created among young girls, young boys who are Muslim but who are also not Muslim. And this question of dignity being at the center of all of these conversations. The dignity of the woman, how important is that?
It is at the heart of the matter. The dignity of the woman, the dignity of the girl child, and the level of protection that we afford, and how we protect and promote that dignity. I think both as Muslim communities in Sri Lanka, in its leadership, in the work that we do, but also at a very national level, we can see that there is not enough female representation in parliament, right? It's a very pathetic level of representation. This is the root cause, that there is not enough representation of women in issues that affect them so intrinsically. So affording that dignity is about also ensuring representation, ensuring that they're included, ensuring that there are safe spaces to talk about these issues, because you need to recognize that women cannot merely come up and talk about these issues. It's hard. You feel like you're going against your family, you feel like you're going against your religion, you feel like you're going against, sometimes even bringing shame on your community by talking about it. But that is not it. You create safe spaces for people who have grievances, who have hardships, who are facing harm. You have to go out of your way, both as a community and as the state, to create these safe spaces, to ensure that your citizens, your community members are being heard and are being responded to.
At the moment, what is the status like of mental health services, counseling services for Muslim women and girls who have to bear the wrath of the impacts of the MMDA?
I would say that across the board, women and girls, not just Muslim women and girls, the services have not developed in a way that it is responding adequately to the issues that women and girls generally face. So if you take a case to court, a divorce case or a custody matter, there are not enough support services that come in to ensure that you have an impartial, non-judgmental, safe process that they can access, and that they're provided that with, even so that they have those options available to them. So as much as we are talking about MMDA reform, we also need to understand that this is happening parallel to the need for family law reforms in general in Sri Lanka, which is also a conversation, something that is a conversation that is happening at the moment. But it is our inability to then respond. We have not done the work so far. This should be something that is regularly studied.
Yeah.
How many people are coming to the district court with these cases? How many people have issues? What are the psychosocial issues that women and girls and men, for that matter, are facing as a result of deterioration in relationships and breakdown of relationships? And are we as a state, do we care? Are we responding? Which I don't think that's where we are. We are very much reactive. And I think when we do react, we have not invested. Really, it's a matter of investing in your citizens, investing in your community members. We have not invested enough in the services and development of services in these areas.
In terms of the reforms proposed by the advisory committee of which you were a member, broadly, can you take us through some of the key recommendations, Amiza?
Sure. So the report was published the report was submitted to the Ministry of Justice in June of 2021. And now the report has been made public. Again, I'm very excited. It does reflect that there were religious scholars, lawyers, academics who were involved as part of the process. And as I said before, very many issues, there were unanimous agreement on them. So for example, marriage registration being necessary for legal validity was something that was agreed on. The fact that the bride's consent and signature and the minimum age of marriage should be 18 at the time had been decided by cabinet. So that was not something that was subjected to deliberation within the committee. It introduced the idea, which is also an Islamic tradition, of marriage contracts, where the parties speak to each other beforehand and decide on things that they want to as part of how they want to take that relationship forward. And in other countries, they talk about even whether the wife will pursue her education, she will do this, or what the husband will do. It engages or gives space for conversation before marriage about these things and create those expectations, right? So we've just, the report recognizes that this is possible and marriage contracts can also be entered into. There is also recognition of dowry because there needs to be, it is a practice, and it is a practice that it creates great hardship on particularly the bride's family. And there is often the problem is that they are unable to recover the dowry property, particularly after the marriage is about a few years old or even a few months, and then it breaks down and you're unable to recover the dowry property. So provisions to recover dowry property have also been introduced. The concept of alimony is not alien to Islam. It's called mata, but it is not in the current MMDA. So a recognition of alimony known as mata has been recommended. Maintenance, that maintenance, when deciding maintenance, you have to look at particular criteria so that you ensure that there is a decent amount of maintenance, something that a person can live on. That criteria has been recognized in the recommendations. Muslim women to hold official positions in the structure or the administration of the MMDA. The fact that I think the report has two parts to it, because in the middle of the deliberation process, there was another cabinet decision which went so far as to say that the Qazi system should be abolished. And in response to that, there was then a need to decide on a system that would accommodate and administer the MMDA. And then a system of conciliators, because was recommended. So community-based conciliators, and then movement of these cases to the district court if they were contested matters. So that was recommended. It's interesting because that debate on the Qazi court is a very sensitive debate. It's like you're taking away something that the Muslim community has had, a structure that has administered a certain kind of justice for a long time, right? But in looking at the Qazi system also, it's the Qazi system, it's not courts. The interesting thing was the benefits of that I was able to, in research and studies on this, was to see that it was embedded in the community. There was access in terms of distance, in terms of language, people felt comfortable. And those are elements that are good for any system, not just Muslim, but the Qazi system was doing that. Where it failed miserably was in its administration of justice, because the training, the capacity, the qualifications of the Qazis was an issue, and then the women were complaining of the treatment and the decisions not being fair. So that needed to be addressed, the level of abuse of power, corruption, those things. So those were addressed in this.
Okay, perfect. Last 3 minutes, speak to us about how important it is for these reforms and the reform, the discourse on the reform process to have the allyship of first, Muslim men. Secondly, Sri Lankans.
Let me start like this. Let me say that the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act is man-made law. It's Dutch brought to Sri Lanka. The Dutch itself had a hand in how it was codified. It is man-made law that we are attempting to reform. It requires the support of the Muslim communities in understanding, particularly those in positions of decision-making and power, to understand the difficulties, hardships, suffering and pain of particularly Muslim women and girls, but I say for also Muslim women and Muslim families. It is really important to understand the lived realities and not to take decisions based on opportunistic or political gain. And if you are responding to the real problems in our communities, then reform is an easy thing to do, and the path is clear. For the state, it is also clear. The state has responsibilities to all its citizens. It can't treat Muslim women and girls in particular as second-class citizens. So on the minimum age of marriage, on the issue of bride signing, the state can take very strong positions because it's protecting and ensuring rights, non-discrimination and equality of Muslim women and girls.
My final question to you is, how urgently must the state now look at this 160-page report that was compiled and released on the internet 3 days ago and implement it? How urgently must this be done? This wasn't done since 1951, since problems were raised, since committees were appointed, showing that Muslim girls and Muslim women suffer as a result of this. There are so many problematic provisions in this law. It needs urgent reform. How urgently must the state now bring in new legislation that encompasses the recommendations of the committee?
I mean, if I were to respond to that, I would say it's already too late. Only because every day that reforms are delayed, there is another young girl, another young woman, another woman who is undergoing some difficulty as a result of the law being the way it is. So it's already too late. And the faster we move towards these reforms, it needs the support of the community leaders also in understanding what the well-being of the community, how the well-being of the community can be protected, right, with these reforms. Because reforms also take time. When you implement them, to get used to the new procedures, things like that. So it needs the support, not just getting the law there, but all of the other support that is required then to make sure that it functions and implements properly. It can't come fast enough, Sonali, really. I get calls from people that I worked with who ask me, has it changed? Because they're waiting. Some are waiting to get married under the new law, some are waiting to get divorced under the new law, but they want a better system, and this hopefully within their lifetimes, that we will see some change as soon as possible. Timelines have been very difficult to pin down with the various governments. I know with the advocacy work that I've been part of, hoping this time around it will be within this year. But time and again we've seen recommendation after recommendation come in, proposals, reports that are gathering dust, and I sincerely hope that it doesn't happen to this set of proposals.
Miza, thank you for so beautifully encapsulating the essence of the reforms. Thank you for all the incredible, difficult work you do. I can imagine how thankless it is, especially working in Sri Lanka, especially working on these reforms as a Muslim woman. So thank you for this.
I really would like to pass on that thanks to also the very many Muslim women's organizations.
Absolutely.
And also progressive men that have been supporting this. Thank you for the opportunity, Sonali. It has been really great. we're really keeping our fingers crossed.
Fantastic. Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again on a Monday with the Sinhala edition of the People's Platform. Have a safe weekend. Good night.